Hello, everybody. Welcome back after lunch break. Hope everybody had a good opportunity to grab a snack and refresh. We're going to begin now with our next part of the programming. So this is Canada's 2030 Nature Strategy Implementation and Reporting. Our speaker today is Andréanne Léger from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Andréanne is the Director of National Biodiversity Policy in the Canadian Wildlife Service of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Prior to joining ECCC, Andréanne spent several years in different roles at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, working on environment and science policy issues. Andréanne studied agricultural science and agricultural economics at McGill University, Wageningen University, and Humboldt University. Welcome, Andréanne. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Brandon. Bonjour tout le monde. Very happy to be here today. So je vais faire la présentation en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions en français aussi, ça me fera plaisir d'y répondre. So I wanted to start with acknowledging that we're here today. I'm speaking to you today from the unsurrendered territories of the Anishinaabe Nation. And I'd like to invite you to think of where you're located currently in your own where you're working and living from. If we can move to slide 2. So basically we're going to, in this presentation, I'm going to provide an overview of what is underway with respect to Canada's 2030 nature strategy when it comes to implementation, but also to reporting. And we're also going to highlight the current federal actions that are supporting implementation of Target 6 of our strategy, which is focused on invasive alien species. So on slide 3, we can see that Canada is one of 5 countries that together contain more than 70% of the world's remaining intact ecosystems. So basically what we do in Canada matters to the world. But at the same time, there's no surprise for this audience. Biodiversity is in steep decline in Canada and also around the world, which of course has implications for our long-term well-being and prosperity. Next slide, please. Internationally, invasive alien species is an important issue, of course, when it comes to international negotiations on biodiversity. The last COP, so the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, held discussions on invasive alien species because it's one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss. So we're just listing here some of those items, so we can think of the adoption of new elements of voluntary guidance for invasive alien species. So we can think about the impacts of e-commerce, for example, the recognition of the importance of the IPBES thematic assessment of IAS, but also the release of the CBD toolkit, which is a study of IAS pathogens and training material to support the implementation of Target 6. And we have links to those different documents at the end of the presentation. It's in the deck. So moving to the next slide, I should have mentioned on the international scene at COP15, a major achievement and a major milestone was the adoption of the KMGBF, the Contming Montréal Global Biodiversity Framework. And each country, in response to the KMGBF, had to implement a national biodiversity strategy and action plan. And of course, the vision of the KMGBF is a world living in harmony with nature. And part of it, of course, is halting and reversing biodiversity loss, which is also the vision for our nature strategy, which we launched last June. So it includes 23 targets and represent really all of society approach. I thought that I might steal the expression that Dr. Bennett was mentioning, like the team of 41 million. This is something that we're also thinking, that I think we should also apply to Canada's nature strategy. It's really a whole of society, whole of government approach to achieving those targets to halting and reversing biodiversity loss in Canada. So basically, the way it's organized is that it reflects existing initiatives and also includes commitments and ideas to go further for all targets. And our strategy, I should mention, is really aligned with the 23 targets of the KMGBF. It follows the same structure. So moving to the next slide. This gives you a snapshot of the 2030 nature strategy. So we have our vision where in 2015, nature is healthy, thriving, and sustaining and enriching the lives of current and future generations. And all Canadians have reestablished their relationship with nature and honoring their responsibilities to nature. So as you can see, this is underlined with our 2030 mission. It's based on 4 pillars: Indigenous rights and reconciliation, a whole of government, whole of society approach, a resilient economy, on-the-ground action, science and knowledge, and integrated and holistic approaches, because there's so many interactions between the different KMGBF targets. And then we have 3 main areas of activity that you can see here. So reducing threats to biodiversity. This is where invasive alien species would fit mostly, but then also meeting people's needs and deploying tools and solutions. So moving to the next slide. For each of the targets in our 2030 nature strategy, we have those implementation plans. So as I mentioned, the strategy addresses all the 23 targets of the Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and it also matches the level of ambition of each of those targets. So each of the targets has a federal implementation plan that includes the current status. So it explains where we're starting from, the challenges and opportunities, so what must be addressed or leveraged to meet the target, then what we're doing. So it gives an overview of what is currently happening within the federal government, keeping in mind that many actions contribute to several targets, and then ideas on what we can do to go further. So it's a high-level list of what governments will do, but also what we may also be exploring. So I'll dig a bit more deeper there. So the implementation plan for Target 6, which is the one on invasive alien species, shows that we have met our 2020 biodiversity target for invasive alien species. It was really focused on pathway identification, risk-based interventions, and management plans for priority pathways and invasive alien species. At this point, we have existing metrics of invasive alien species, but they provide an incomplete view of the situation. We know that there's a lot of action underway by all sectors of society to address invasive alien species, but those threats of invasive alien species are expected to grow as they are interacting with other drivers of biodiversity loss. For example, an obvious one is climate change. And I guess part of the current status is to recognize the fact that federal efforts alone are not going to be sufficient to achieve Target 6. So and I think again, this is reflecting a bit the attendance of this conference and the importance that everybody has to be involved in contributing to addressing IAS when it comes to provinces and territories, municipalities, Indigenous peoples, non-governmental organizations, industry, and citizens in general. In terms of challenges and opportunities, what we see is there's a lack of public awareness of the impacts of invasive alien species, but also of the actions that everybody can take to mitigate them. There's a need for additional tools. There's gaps in science, gaps in monitoring, gaps in data that I mentioned already. And then there's a complex legislative and regulatory landscape and a need really for lots of coordination across the different levels of governance, but also of different sectors. At the same time, there are several opportunities. So we have an opportunity to advance a whole of society, whole of government approach. I think that the strategy offers us this impetus. We have an opportunity to adopt common definitions when we think, for example, about priority species, pathways, sites, just making sure that we understand what we're talking about from our different perspectives. We can adopt a biosecurity lens using digital tools. We can also address IAS to support more effective emergency response, and we can also look at data collection and aggregation at the national scale. So going on to the next slide. What we're doing right now, so we have started, so we've been for a while, we had developed an invasive alien species national strategy in 2004. So this is the basis on which we coordinate policy efforts and we share best practices. We have an FPT, Federal Provincial Territorial Governance Structure, on that concentrated on conservation, wildlife, and biodiversity that helps share information, best practices, and coordinate across different jurisdictions. We there's lots of collaborative work happening in international fora, as exemplified at the beginning. We are, of course, administering and enforcing legislation and regulations and providing funding to improve the capacity of non-governmental organizations. And we're helping to promote the uptake and distribution of education and awareness tools. So we have a few examples here of what's been done. Of course, the scientific activities that support early detection and response is also an important part of what we're doing at the federal government, as well as more work looking at understanding and mitigating the economic impacts of IAS on the different economic sectors. And then we're also looking at developing those, or we have those integrated risk assessments in place, and we're doing horizon scanning to make sure that we anticipate as much as possible the IAS that might be threatening entry into North America and Canada. So as I said, there's a few examples here of more specifically of those actions, but we can come back to that in the discussion if you're interested in having more detail. So moving to the next slide, this is what we will do, what we're planning on doing to advance work on Target 6. So we're going to continue to work with provinces and territories to ensure that there are clear roles and responsibilities, and also to identify any gaps that we would need to address. We're also working with provinces and territories to examine the need to update the 2004 IAS strategy for Canada. So this is something that is happening right now. We're looking also at, we have started integrating IAS considerations into existing work. So when we're talking about climate change modeling, when we're talking about restoration efforts on the ground, in our monitoring efforts, we're including those IAS considerations in the existing work. We're also committed to increasing knowledge on the biodiversity and the socioeconomic impacts of IAS using different tools. And we're also engaging Canadians and Indigenous peoples to take part in action on invasive alien species. So next slide. I just want to talk a bit about the reporting because a big part, so it's very good news that we have our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. So our nature strategy has been launched. There's lots of work underway. We have a very good basis to start from. One of the commitments that we have made to the Convention on Biological Diversity is that we have to report on progress made. So each country has to do that, and those reports are due to the CBD in February 2026. So the idea here is really to capture the progress made until the end of this fiscal year, so until the end of March, against a baseline of 2021. And this is going to allow us to look at, collectively or globally, look at the progress made, but also nationally, we're going to be able to assess the progress achieved through existing initiatives, but also looking at measuring this progress with the indicators that we have, including a narrative assessment. So we really want to talk about what's been done, the outcomes, of course, but also the effectiveness of the actions that have been taken, the challenges, and also the future opportunities that might be there for more action. And we, as I said, it is a whole of society, whole of government strategy. So it also needs to be a whole of society report. So we really want to make sure we reflect input from provinces and territories, from national or Indigenous organizations and civil society. So we're really interested in hearing about your work and about how it could be reflected in our 7th national report. We're going to be engaging through our existing networks, but if you're interested in sending us information, this could take place, this is going to be good information for us to have. We might also reach out again to turn those into little vignettes, providing specific examples of the good work done. So if we are not reaching out to you, please reach out to me. My email address is also included in the deck. So we're really looking forward to having information from you and being able to report on the work done against, to help halt and reverse biodiversity loss. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic, Andréanne. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was it's amazing to see the national perspective, as well as how it ties into sort of a little bit far-reaching global perspective as well. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Just want to open up. We do have a couple minutes for questions. There's nothing in the Q&A yet. If there's anybody has any questions, just drop them in the Q&A, and we'll go from there. Otherwise, if we don't see that, then maybe we'll move on to the next presentation. We're a couple minutes ahead.
Can I just make a plug for something I forgot to say, please?
Yes,
so
for sure.
We are looking for new members for our Nature Advisory Committee. The process is still open until January 24th. So if you're interested, we would really encourage people from this group to apply and be able to contribute to advising the government and the minister on those important nature-related issues. So just wanted to make sure everybody was aware the process is still open. And again, you can contact me if you want to have more information, or I could put the link in the chat. Thanks.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much again. All right, thank you very much for your presentation. We're going to move on to the next topic here. So as Vicky gets the slides up, our next presenters, our next topic is invasive species policy and legislation in Ontario. And I'd like to welcome Arnique Dumbos and Lauren Efford from the Ministry of Natural Resources. Arnique is an invasive species policy advisor in the biodiversity invasive species section of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. She started working with the ministry in June of 2022 after moving to Canada from the Netherlands. With her climate policy and environmental sciences background, she provides, among others, policy advice on invasive species and pathway management, best management practices, and process improvement. Lauren Efford is a Canadian a conservation programs advisor with the biodiversity and invasive species section at the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. Since 2020, Lauren has been committed to advancing climate change biodiversity and invasive species policy. Her work involves developing and implementing strategies to protect Ontario's natural resources and promote sustainable practices. Welcome, Arnique and Lauren.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brandon. So hi, everyone. I'm Lauren, and I'm going to start off the presentation today before handing things over to my colleague, Arnique. And so today we're going to start with an overview of the impacts of invasive species in Ontario, and then the ministry's role in managing them. And then next, we're going to highlight some key policies and legislation and some regulated species and pathways before wrapping up an overview of our response framework in action. And so to get us started, we wanted to introduce or refamiliarize the audience with the widespread impacts of invasive species in Ontario, which threaten our environment, our economy, and society, including human health. And those impacts can be seen in the graphic on our right. And so if you didn't know, invasive species undermine Ontario's biodiversity and habitats by threatening the essential goods and services that they produce to support our communities and economy. And actually in 2019, the economic impact of invasive species was estimated at about $3.6 billion, affecting sectors such as agriculture, fisheries, forestry, tourism, and more. And beyond the economic and environmental effects, invasive species also reduce opportunities for outdoor recreation like swimming or boating and fishing, overall diminishing Ontarians' quality of life and well-being. And so given these challenges, what is the ministry's role in invasive species management? And so for the purpose of this presentation, we've broken down the role into about 4 categories. And so first we have policy and response, and this includes assessing the risk of invasive species to Ontario and where appropriate, taking action to prevent or reduce those impacts. And one key tool in this toolbox is our guiding policy and legislation, which includes the Ontario Invasive Species Strategic Plan, as well as the Invasive Species Act. And we're going to touch on those in just a few more slides. Our second category today, we have research and monitoring. And efforts in this category focus on developing tools for prevention, detection, and control, while also studying the impacts on biodiversity. And so we have several examples highlighted here. So first, we have the ministry's broad-scale monitoring program, which routinely samples hundreds of inland lakes, providing information on different stressors, including aquatic invasive species. The ministry also supports our partners and their research to develop biocontrol options for invasive species such as dog strangling vine or Phragmites. And we also proactively manage the risk of invasive wild pigs, focusing on prevention through ongoing research and monitoring. And of course, oh, sorry, Nick, just one more. Of course, since 2016, Ontario has also tackled the threat of Phragmites, where we've restored over 1,600 hectares of critical wetlands in the Long Point region through MNR's collaborative research with its partners. Okay, so now our third category, we have education and outreach, and this includes the ministry and our partners educating Ontarians on the impact, rules, and different prevention methods. And so, for example, the ministry promotes our invasive species action plans, which help raise awareness for prevention during activities like boating, gardening, and hiking. Also support the Ontario Invasive Plant Council's Grow Me Instead guides, which educate gardeners on invasive plants and native alternatives, overall supporting invasive-free gardening in Ontario. And then lastly, we also support the best management practices and guides, which support and provide the public with a detailed background of the history of a plant, how to identify it, and how to properly manage it as well. And so lastly, our fourth category here, we have collaboration, and this includes influencing and leveraging as well as supporting binational, federal, and provincial and territorial efforts to stop and reduce the spread of invasive species. So in the diagram to our right, you can see this relationship between different provincial ministries as well as federal agencies and our key partners. And because invasive species know no geographic boundaries, it's really important to put a focus on collaboration, as it is a critical role in our invasive species management. And then also for collaboration, I did want to announce that in the fall of last year, the Ontario government invested an additional $16 million over the next 3 years to defend against invasive species through its excellent partnerships. And so 2 examples of these partnerships are grant funding opportunities with the Invasive Species Centers through their Invasive Species Action Fund, as well as the Invasive Phragmites Control Fund. And so the Action Fund application deadline has actually just closed just yesterday for the 2025 year. However, the Phragmites Control Fund application is still open and runs until February 12th if anyone is interested in that opportunity. And so if we look at these 4 categories, a common thread across the 4 efforts is a strong focus on prevention. So in every role the ministry plays in managing invasive species, it prioritizes actions aimed at stopping or reducing their introduction. And this is critical because once an invasive species becomes established, as we may know, it can be extremely challenging and costly to control, with potentially irreversible impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity. So if we keep that in mind, I am going to shift our focus a bit more to just Ontario's invasive species policy and legislation, which are 2 key tools for prevention. And there's no other place to start than with the Ontario Invasive Species Strategic Plan. It was first introduced in 2012, and it was developed collaboratively with partner ministries and key stakeholders. The strategic plan outlines Ontario's approach to invasive species, focusing on 4 core goals. We have prevention, detection, response, and management adaptation. And under these goals, the plan sets commitments to prevent new invasions, to slow the introduction and spread of existing species, and to mitigate their harmful impacts. And actually, in very exciting news, the ministry is currently working to update and renew the strategic plan, ensuring that it continues to address current and emerging challenges effectively. So it is thanks to the Ontario Invasive Species Strategic Plan that we also have the Invasive Species Act, or the ISA, which was introduced in 2015 and took effect in 2016. And the ISA provides the authority to implement prevention and response measures, and it provides a range of tools, including the ability to ban activities that introduce or spread high-risk invasive species, restrictions on invasive species and their carriers, as well as powers to take response actions to address urgent threats, and enforcement measures and inspections to ensure compliance with prohibitions, and finally, promotion of partnerships and shared accountability to support collaborative efforts in managing invasive species. And actually, did you know that to date, we have 42 species, 4 groups, 1 family, and 2 carriers that are regulated under the ISA. And on this next slide here, you can actually see all of those species and the carriers regulated. It is quite a lot to take in, and we don't have too much time to go through each one. So I do just want to highlight the regulation of watercraft and equipment at the bottom in the gray. And because I do want to highlight that because as of January 1st of 2022, under the ISA, it became mandatory to clean and drain watercraft and watercraft equipment when transporting them overland in Ontario. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is because they are the first regulated pathways under the Invasive Species Act in Ontario. And regulating pathways like watercraft and watercraft equipment is critical for prevention efforts, preventing the spread of invasive species such as aquatic invasive fish, we have plants, zebra mussels, and diseases. And it is through controlling pathways of introduction and spread that Ontario can better help protect its biodiversity and reduce the long-term management costs. And so at this point, that ends my little part of this presentation. So I am going to hand it over to Arnique to walk us through our response framework.
Thanks so much, Lauren. So yeah, we wanted to give you a little bit of a case study after kind of this more technical background information. I don't want to call it boring, Lauren. So we thought we would highlight our response framework in action. So we have this framework to kind of have a structured way to respond to a new invasive species coming into Ontario or a part of Ontario. And I wanted to give a high-level overview of this framework, so I kind of left out all the approval processes that I didn't want to bore you with. And the main thing that I wanted to highlight is how collaborative this process is. So go through kind of like an example situation. So let's say a member of the public finds an invasive species. This gentleman is out for a stroll around Lake Simcoe in the summer of 2024, and he spots water soldier. And he notices that on his previous walks, he didn't see this plant species. So he's a little bit concerned about how quickly this has spread. So he decides to either call it in to the invading species hotline or use the app on his phone called AdMaps to send in this observation. Next up, it arrives at the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, and they verify this observation. So they either take the call or look at the AdMaps observation and make sure that the species is correct that the person has identified it as. And sometimes they contact us or other partners to confirm those identifications. So we confirm it, and then you can see it pop up on the map, Lake Simcoe, water soldier. Now our work begins at MNR. As you can see, any new invasive species to Ontario is not a happy day for us, but it's part of the job, so we have to continue with our work. So we confirm that this species is new to this part of Ontario, as currently it's only in the Trent Severn Waterway and the Bay of Quinte. Next, we assess whether this species is a high-risk species to the natural environment in Ontario. And in this case, water soldier is regulated under the Invasive Species Act, as Lauren already mentioned. So that means we already have a risk assessment for this species, and we know that it is a high-risk species. We discussed this new observation with our relevant government counterparts and also our partners, which leads us to step 6. Most of the time, our partners are best positioned to get the message out about invasive species. So in this case, the Invasive Species Center implements the communication protocol and got the message out that water soldier was found in Lake Simcoe, and they also gave some tips about what the public can do. The next step, and I know this sounds kind of linear, but some of these things happen all at the same time. But the next step is that we initiate the formation of a working group, and that consists of people who know the lay of the land and have local informations. So those can be local governments and Indigenous communities, conservation authorities, and provincial and federal counterparts, and also other organizations. And at the same time, we quickly assess any immediate measures that need to be taken. This is often done with the working group. So every situation is different, the species characteristics, the place, etc. So we look at the situation and see what we can do to contain this population and also maybe put out signage, things like that. Then a large part of the working group's time goes towards gathering information. So this is evaluating the extent of the infestation through site visits and also assessing the threat to other jurisdictions, especially when a species is found in one of the Great Lakes. You can imagine that is a bigger risk for our US neighbors. So you can see an example here of a map with all the densities of the invasive species, and that really helps to formulate our management plans. So that's the last step, the implementation of our management plan. And that's an ongoing process, which includes continued monitoring to see the impacts of our management actions on the population. And it also, of course, the changes over time with that population. These implementation plans are very adaptive as we continue to learn more about the species and work with our partners. So that is kind of the end of that little case study. And I wanted to plug, based on that, for you to please report any sightings of invasive species that you come across. So as I mentioned before, there is the invading species hotline that you can call if you come across any species. They're really happy to take the call, can help you with identification and so on. There's also an online method. AdMaps is both an app and a website. And you can also, if you already have iNaturalist on your phone, you can visit the Invasive Species in Ontario project and add your sightings there. I also wanted to plug the Invasive Phragmites Control Fund that Lauren mentioned before. So those are still open for application. So if you are interested in carrying out management of Phragmites, have a look at that. You can look on their website and do apply for funding before February 12th. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren and Arnique. That was excellent presentation on what's happening in Ontario. Really appreciate it today. We have about 10 minutes for questions here, so that's fantastic. So that folks have put in the chat. So the first question, I'll just go through them as they came in. And if we're not able to get to all of them, then maybe if you want to just go to the live chat or the Q&A, sorry, and you can answer those questions after. But first question, why am I still able to buy goutweed and winged burning bush and other ornamental invasives at my local nursery? And what's the point essentially of the 2015 legislation?
Yeah, that's a great question. We often hear kind of this sentiment. So as we heard throughout the day today as well, is that the most important part of our work in invasive species is the prevention of their introduction. That's where the money we invest in this work is the most effective. So I know that the spread of seeing those species in the province is kind of like difficult and concerning to see, but it's important to keep in mind that prohibiting the sale of those species is unlikely to prevent their further spread. They're already well established in a natural environment often, and they have multiple pathways of spread. So that can either be dispersal by wind, wildlife, or water, and also unintentional human activities. So of course, that being said, we're really committed to trying to prevent the spread of these invasive species. So we continue to do risk assessments to understand the potential impact of these species. And we also want to see whether regulation under the Invasive Species Act is an effective tool for the prevention of this spread. We also really appreciate the efforts at the local level to prevent the spread of invasive species and to educate and encourage gardeners to choose native species. And actually, the OIPC has some really great resources for this. So the Grow Me Instead guide, which we mentioned before, is an awesome way that you may wish to kind of share with people that you know or organizations that you work with. And also the best management practices for species that may have been established in your area. So those are great resources for this cause.
Great, thank you, Arnique. Move on to the next question. The next two questions are similar in nature, so I'll try to kind of summarize them. Essentially, who's in charge of cleaning boats regulations? And the next question is there a plan to mandate cleaning of construction and recreational equipment? And have there been any charges for cleaning of watercrafts?
I'll see if my manager wants to answer that question if she's on the line. Therese? Not sure if she is. Yeah. Awesome.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. So the first part of the question is who is in charge of the clean and dry regulation. So it is MNR, and it is enforced through our enforcement branch. And recognizing that these regulations are based on the clean, drain, dry best practices we've been promoting for about 25 years now. So it's really just putting that into action. So we do enforce it through our enforcement branch. I can't tell you off the top of my head if there's been any charges. When we do have new regulations, though, we do tend to start with education first, right? Letting people know. We have put hundreds and hundreds of signs up across the province, including at all of our Crown land, boat launches and that kind of stuff. So getting the word out there. We're also working with lots of partners like Boating Ontario, Federation of Ontario Cottage Associations, all of those folks to sort of get the message out there. But where there are blatant breaking of the rules, charges can be laid by our enforcement officers. And in terms of sort of like the clean equipment protocols that you're mentioning, so we do have rules in place, particularly for movement of species that are listed. So for example, if you are cleaning out a ditch and you have Phragmites, that kind of stuff, there are rules under the Act that you can't sort of go and dump those someplace else or drag it around the province. But it is a pathway that we are looking at and could be regulated under the ISA in the future.
Great, thank you. We'll try one more question here. And then maybe you can go to the Q&A and try to follow up with some other questions there.
Sure.
What's the process? Keeps changing here. What's the process to get a risk assessment done for a new invasive species to a local area?
I can start maybe, Therese, and then if I miss anything, you can add. So we continually scan, it's called horizon scanning, for new invasive species to see if anyone are in our neighboring jurisdictions or other information that we have of potential invasive species coming into Ontario. And then we kind of do a first level of assessment of how likely it is that they would establish in the province or that they would become introduced. For example, if they are in an existing pathway that we know of, that they're kind of like imminently arriving into the province. That's kind of our selection process. And then we'll do a really in-depth risk assessment process for those species that would kind of we assume have that likelihood, and that kind of confirms like if there's a strong climate match, if they have a large impact on the economy or kind of like the social side of things. I don't know if I'm missing anything, Therese.
Yeah, that was really good, Arnique. And I might add that we do have sort of a public process. So when we select, some potential species that we are considering regulating, we do post them on the Environmental Registry of Ontario. People can comment on those species, and they can also share information on other species at that time that they think could be regulated, and that happens all the time. And then we take that information all together and then post the regulations. And we've done, I'm not sure how many batches now, 3 or 4 batches of regulations of new species, and we continue to do that on a regular basis.
Yeah, and as well, if people email any concerns into us at invasive.species@ontario.ca, we always answer those inquiries, and that kind of also informs what people are worried about, what they come across in Ontario. So that really helps us as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's great, thank you. Thanks for answering those questions. We have a couple minutes left, but I think maybe we could move on to the next speaker. And again, thank you, Arnique. Thank you, Lauren, for your presentation. Really, really informative. And if you want to attend the Q&A there and just provide some answers, if you can, to some of those, that would be appreciative.
For sure.
Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. While the slides are getting ready for the next presentation, I'll introduce, and this is the theme of this presentation is the Hamilton Conservation Authority's invasive prioritization planning. So I'll introduce Ben Lang and Bryson McEwen from the Hamilton Conservation Authority. Ben and Bryson are the Hamilton Conservation Authority's invasive species technicians, focused primarily on terrestrial plants and emerging forest pests. Their typical scope of work includes pesticide applications and manual removal work, distribution mapping, pest and pathogen surveys, public outreach and stewardship on private and public lands, and prioritization planning on conservation-owned lands. Ben holds a bachelor's degree in environment, resources, and sustainability from the University of Waterloo, and a master's in environmental assessment from Concordia University. His previous work experience includes outdoor education environmental compliance, and nonprofit work. Bryson holds a diploma in the environmental technician program at Niagara College with a focus on sampling and monitoring. He's a new addition to the field of environmental conservation, having joined the Hamilton Conservation Authority in 2021. In their role, Ben and Bryson have been developing a framework that can effectively map and communicate invasive species distributions to non-ecology-based conservation area staff with the goal of helping them undertake removal and management work independently. This system has yielded both success and challenges in its second year of implementation, both of which they are excited to share. So with that, Ben and Bryson, welcome.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay and see our screen. Myself and Bryson will be passing off throughout the presentation. But yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to jump right into it. We have a lot we're excited to share today. My name is Ben Lang. I'm one of the two invasive techs here at Hamilton Conservation, along with my colleague Bryson. And we're looking forward to spending some time today talking about prioritization planning and some of the lessons we've learned through this process. So a brief overview, we'll be spending some time on our background and how the HCA came about developing these prioritization plans, but we'll spend most of our time focusing on the creation of our final report, the process we took to collect data and build a framework for ranking priority areas and species, and then discuss some of the successes, challenges, and next steps as it relates to prioritization planning. So a bit of background, like Brandon mentioned in the introduction, I'll just go over this very briefly. HCA's invasive species program, it's overseen by myself and Bryson, the two techs. We have support from our ecology, stewardship, and conservation area services departments. Our work is guided primarily by provincial legislation, so the Invasive Species Act, pesticide regulations, that kind of thing. We also have our own internal invasive species strategy that outlines our long-term planning and our goal setting. And we also have site-specific conservation area master plans for the different sites we choose to focus on. And as Brenda mentioned, our core duties, mapping and surveys, treatments, prevention measures, public outreach, and stewardship on privately owned lands in our watershed. So while we're trying to accomplish these duties and meet these expectations set out in our strategies and master plans, we frequently encounter problems and challenges that I'm sure are familiar to many of those in attendance today. Invasive species, which in most cases for us, again, are focused on terrestrial plants, as well as forest pests and pathogens, are very complex. It's easy to get lost in the muck when we're trying to decide what we need to do, what's most important, and also when these things need to happen. Also, with changing conditions inside and outside of the workplace, keeping efforts going strong year over year is also a challenge. Sometimes it's as simple as just figuring out where to start that leads to the most headaches. The Hamilton Conservation Authority manages over 11,000 acres of land, so it's really important to understand where we need to prioritize and what's most important. So to overcome these challenges and better organize our information and recommendations, we started the process of creating prioritization plans, which would become reports containing maps, tables, recommendations, best practices, with the goal of creating actionable items that could be accomplished in a multi-year process. We also really wanted to share the work, so that would be involving other departments, including those not previously involved in invasive species management. We wanted a framework that we could input our data, mostly spatial data and mapping data, into, and find specific populations, areas, or individual plants to target for removal that would rank higher due to their status, location, size, or threat level. So the area that we selected for our first planning process is Valens Lake Conservation Area located in Flamborough, Ontario. So Valens Lake is home to a reservoir, managed reservoir, a provincially significant wetlands and significant woodlands, as well as campgrounds, a beach, and hiking trails. Valens received updates to its master plan prior to the beginning of this prioritization process, and that's a pattern that we've been continuing. So we're able to use existing data such as ecological land classification or ELC data, past invasive species mapping, and other data to make a more educated decision when selecting sites for prioritization. So the Conservation Authority is home to a variety of invasive species spread across different types of natural areas. Phragmites has been managed in an ongoing fashion for almost a decade on site. Many of the trailside and campground edge habitats are perfect for common and glossy buckthorn, invasive honeysuckle, Ottoman Russian olive. Additionally, we do have forest pests and pathogens detected on site, including LDD moth, as well as beech leaf and beech bark disease. These have all been detected on site and are things that are being mapped and managed in an ongoing fashion. So at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Bryson, who can speak to the actual creation of our plan and some of the steps we took when we created and collected our data.
Hi, everyone. So as Ben said, I'll start by discussing how we approached to creating our prioritization plan. The first step we took was to review how other land managers in Ontario have approached invasive species prioritization. So these 4 documents were key reference points for informing our project objectives, mapping protocol, and the criteria we used for ranking the invasive species populations in our prioritization framework. I'd like to express my gratitude to everyone who worked on these plans because we found them extremely helpful in our project development. So next we'll talk about mapping, which we completed using a QGIS-based software. Our initial approach to mapping was to record distribution of every invasive species we came across while serving the Valens Lake property in its entirety. However, flaws with this method quickly became apparent. First, Valens Lake Conservation Area covers approximately 350 hectares, so mapping that area in detail would be a huge task and, more importantly, not time efficient. It was also challenging to accurately capture the spatial extent of invasive species populations in high detail for a number of reasons. Populations of different species overlapped, meaning boundaries weren't so cut and dry. Sometimes species were spread across several different ecosystem types, some of which were inaccessible or unsafe to access. And lastly, sometimes the density of invasive plants fluctuated throughout an area. So this forced us to waste time on site deciding where one polygon might begin or one polygon might end and another might begin. So eventually we settled on a mapping methodology to use for the project that was much more time efficient and realistic. To start, we more thoroughly consulted existing maps and invasive species distribution data before visiting the site. We subdivided large sections of continuous natural area into smaller polygons to give some structure to our mapping excursions. And we used ELC or existing ELC data for this because we had that information at hand. However, in my experience, aerial photos would work well enough to outline habitat boundaries if that's all you have. Once we had our subdivisions in place, we walked transects through the center of each of those polygons to determine which, if any, invasive species were present. So for recording the data, we ended up naturally falling into what I would call a twofold mapping method. For large areas where invasives were widespread throughout, we mapped large polygons to characterize those areas generally. So an example of this would be a 17-hectare swamp with small buckthorn seedlings scattered uniformly throughout. But where distinct clusters or outlying populations of invasives existed, we mapped those as more detailed polygons. So an example of this would be a smaller, medium-sized invasion of Phragmites on the shore of the reservoir, or isolated patches of autumn olive in an open field. Our key takeaway from this process was to capture granular information about the invasive species present, only when we predicted that we could act upon it within the scope of the plan. So next we'll look at the significant features of the final report. Of course, prevention is the first step of invasive species management. So we included recommendations for preventative actions like a rinsing station at the boat launch and boot brushes at trailheads. We next provided a summary of invasive species found on the property and listed the species by their invasiveness ranking. And we pulled this ranking from the Urban Forest Associates Resource Invasive Species of Southern Ontario. Following that is the prioritization framework and priority classes, which I'll go over in more detail in the next slide. And finally, we gave recommendations for management technique by species. Our key takeaway from the report writing process was to start with clear action items in chart and list formats where possible. Because of other competing priorities, non-ecology staff are often unable to spend time reading through a long and wordy document, so giving clear instructions up front is very important. And lastly, I'll talk about our prioritization framework and how that resulted in priority classes that provide direction for management. So we compiled a list of criteria that we use to judge invasive plant populations, which include, but aren't limited to those shown on the screen here. Like many of the prioritization methods we researched, we decided that our framework needed to account for both ecological considerations, like the threat level of the invading plant, plus more practical considerations like the time commitment for removal. These attributes formed the basis of our prioritization framework. However, this is the point at which the framework differs from, say, a decision matrix that assigns numerical scores based on the criteria. Instead, we created 5 priority classes, each with their own descriptive characteristics, and then examined all of the mapped invasive populations and placed them in one of the classes. So this allows for context-based decisions that consider a larger list of criteria while not getting too lost in the minutiae of assigning values to attributes for hundreds of polygons on a property. In essence, I think this method reflects what many invasive species managers do intuitively already. However, the framework provides some consistency to that decision-making, which can be communicated to staff who have less familiarity with the subject. So this here is an example of our priority class 1 from our Valens Lake report. Populations in class 1 are small to medium infestations of high priority species, meaning those that spread very easily and then dominate wherever they exist. So here you'd see Phragmites, highly invasive shrubs, and allelopathic plants like garlic mustard. Dog strangling vine and Japanese knotweed would also be present on this list. However, they've not been found on the property. And each priority class has its own map, as you can see. So all the polygons on the map refer back to the table using a polygon code. And then the table outlines the ideal timeline for management, the location within the property, and then the removal method for that specific polygon. After the infestations in class 1 have been managed, or when time allows otherwise, class 2 is then targeted. Class 2 populations are very small groupings of any invasive species that can be eradicated with a very short time commitment. This allows us to achieve progress while using resources efficiently. Despite being slightly less invasive, these species can still dominate their landscape. They include plants like periwinkle, Norway maple, and oriental bittersweet. And then class 3 contains small to medium populations of any species that threaten areas of high ecological value. Targeted management within larger populations can also be considered circumstantially. So it should be noted that a population is put into the highest class for which it matches all characteristics. So if there's a medium-sized population of Phragmites threatening a significant wetland, it would actually be placed in class 1, even though it also meets all of the criteria for class 3. And if anyone's interested in reading more about the priority classes in more depth, please feel free to contact Ben or I, and we'd be happy to provide you with a copy of the report. And I'll pass it back to Ben to discuss our successes and challenges with creating this plan.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bryson. So coming off of our first prioritization plan, we had some results we were very happy with. We were able to meet our set goal of creating an actionable report, and we got solid buy-in and support from staff at Valens Lake. So this included collaboratively working to include shared priorities and involving summer staff in a removal event to help get more HCA staff educated and involved with invasive species. The data we collected has not only been used for this plan, but also for other projects in our watershed, and was of a quality that was useful for ourselves when revisiting the site, and conservation area services staff to help understand the data. With the report finished in the spring of 2024, we were able to tackle our year 1 goals, including some single individual shrub removals, beginning work on manual and pesticide application areas, and continue to work on Phragmites management in the reservoir. Arguably more important than those successes as we build out our prioritization framework and create more of these plans were the challenges we encountered and the lessons learned. One of the biggest challenges was our mapping experience, as Bryson outlined, and although we did settle on the methodology after trial and error, we've still been toying with that methodology, and for the next plan we created in 2024, we adapted it further. Environmental and invasive species work is very busy, and when field season arrives, you're always balancing other priorities. It would be great to devote a week in the spring and the summer and the fall to map invasives at different emergence periods, but between other priorities and duties, that's often just not possible. So for a project like this, it's really important to use that existing data and have a set process and framework for ordering and ranking these areas and these species in order to streamline the process. Another thing we encountered was sometimes ranking something higher just because it seems right isn't good enough. There'd be times where we'd plug in our spatial data and compare it to our other areas and expect a result and not have it come up that way. However, that doesn't mean that that result is bad or inaccurate. and that's not enough impetus to go back and scratch everything off the drawing board. So having a plan, sticking to the plan, and then changing it next time is completely fine. Similarly, things will always come up, unexpected things. Sometimes you arrive to survey a forest and discover it's a swamp. Learning to be adaptable is a key feature of invasive species planning. So where do we go from here? After finishing Valens in 2024, we've started a plan at another property, which we've adapted to be more landscape-based with a higher amount of focus placed on restoration. In contrast, where the Valens plan was very focused on species by species management, we're experimenting with more management by area and ecosystem and seeing how that changes our management approach. As we move into 2025, we're hoping these different approaches will give us flexibility as we tackle 2 more plans for other HCA properties. And we want to have plans that best match the environment and priorities at each site. Also, through using master plans and other recently published documents, we've learned to better incorporate existing data to streamline mapping and report writing to maximize our time in the field, and we want to do this more in the future as well. Continuing to collaborate with our partners, either other departments within the HCA or our friends locally, where land management could be shared along borders or shared ecosystems. Of course, we're always on the lookout for new strategies and techniques and news of invasive species in our local ecosystem. And all of these things are going to help better manage our invasive species and help the prioritization process. So thank you very much for listening. We'll be happy to take any questions at this point. As Bryson mentioned, we are also more than happy to circulate the report if people are looking for exemplars or have other questions later. Feel free to get in contact with us with whatever preferred method works for you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Thank you, Bryson. I really appreciate that that presentation on what's happening in Hamilton, CA. Fantastic. There is one question in the Q&A right now, and if you go to the Q&A after the break there, you can maybe touch on some questions we didn't get to, but is there a good resource that show proper management and treatment types for the major invasive species?
Yes, definitely. So when we were putting our report together, a key section was we had our priority species and key species listed. We would take information for a variety of sources. The best management practice documents from OIPC and the Invasive Species Center we leaned on very heavily. They often had great resources. A lot of them are updated fairly frequently. So that's a big one. I'd look at those. We would also look at some scientific studies or resources for from the US. Just looking for some of the species we had, like Phragmites. There's plenty of resources locally, but some of the new species we encounter, for instance, we're surveying for oak wilt and beech diseases and hemlock woolly delegate at a lot of our properties, and there might be less information locally, so that would be where we'd look to some sources from our friends to the south.
That's great, thank you. We've got a couple minutes left here, so next question is how effective are the extractigator tools in buckthorn removal, and which size tool is recommended?
We use those quite heavily, especially in volunteer removals. We find them to be quite effective, specifically for common and glossy buckthorn. Plants like autumn olive, for example, with a deeper taproot, those are less effective tools for that type of plant. But you can be surprised with the size of plant you can pull out with an extractigator. Generally, we find the larger size. So there's the junior extractigator and the standard one with the foot on it. We find the larger size is more effective the majority of the time.
That's great. Thank you. The last question is the report public on the HCA website, or do you have to request it?
So as of now, it's not public. One of our goals for this year is to get an invasive species landing page on our website that will have all these documents in the future. So it's by no means a confidential document, but it's not publicly available in the sense of you can go online and download it. So if you do want a copy, just let us know. That's the easiest way to get a hold of it at this time.
All right, that's great. Thank you. considering the time now, we'll move on to the break, but I want to thank Ben and Bryson again for your presentation. And if you have a chance to stop in the Q&A and just answer a few of those questions if we didn't get to, that'd be great. So thanks very much, everybody, for those series of presentations, really informative. Emily, do you want to touch on the break here and what's going to happen after?
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. And thank you everyone for all those great presentations. So we're going to be moving into a 10-minute break. And then after that, we'll have our concurrent sessions. So the sessions will be running parallel to each other. You won't be able to join 1 and 2 at the same time, but at the end of each presentation, a staff member is going to put a link in the chat that you can click to seamlessly move over to the other session. And I did pin a comment in the lobby chat that has the agenda linked. You can review that and decide which presentations that you want to view. But yeah, with that, I'm going to send us on a break and look forward to seeing everybody in our next session.